Hello, my name is Dr. Lee Ray, and today I'm here to talk to you about how people used to change wildflowers into medicine in the 17th century in Scotland. Now, in order to help me talk about that today, I'm here at Cardiff University in the School of Pharmacy, and in front of me I have some amazing items from the Turner collection. Now, the Turner collection is a collection of historical pharmaceutical items, and we have here some which are similar to some which would have been used in the 17th century. Ignore the glass, which I've just used for collecting wildflowers. But in particular, I want to draw your attention to this. This mortar and pestle has a date on it. Let's have a look. It is from anno 1642, so right in the middle of the 17th century. What a fantastic item. Okay, before I get to talking into how people actually created medicine in the 17th century, I want to give you a brief overview of how I know that. I'm not actually a medical historian. I'm a wildlife and wildflower historian, I suppose. But my knowledge of this subject comes from this book here. This book is Scotia Illustrata. It was published in 1684 in Edinburgh in Scotland, and it has sections on all of the natural resources from across Scotland. Now, the section I've been working on this year is section 2, book 1, which is the Wildflowers of Scotland, or it's actually called the Wild Occurring Plants of Scotland, but that wasn't as catchy for the Twitter hashtag. Now, this book is obviously supposed to be a natural history, but it's very interesting for medical history for, I suppose, two reasons. And those reasons both have to do with the compiler, or the author, who was Robert Sibbald. Now, Robert Sibbald was one of the co-founders of the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. And as part of that, he was very interested in, first of all, what medicines could be found around Scotland. He was of the opinion, which was one side of a big debate in the 17th century, that every disease which occurred in an area and every disorder could be treated by use of the wildflowers or the natural resources of that same area. That God had furnished the world to allow so that there were natural remedies available wherever a disease naturally occurred. He also had a second belief, which is just as interesting. He believed that medicine should be available to everyone for free or for as cheaply as they could afford. Now, this was quite a striking belief, because in the 17th century there was a movement towards the professionalisation of medicine. It had been happening already in the 16th century, but in Scotland it really takes off in the 17th century, and we see the university-trained physicians, of whom Robert Sibbald was one, really looking down on the empirics and the quack doctors and people who weren't university-trained and were acting, I suppose, from local knowledge which had been passed down or from their own observations. Now, because of that movement, medicine was becoming more expensive in the 17th century, and this was partly, I suppose, the physician's fault. So Robert Sibbald really wanted medicine to remain within reach of ordinary people. So when he was looking through the natural resources of Scotland, he was especially interested in the use of these natural resources for medicine, because he believed that there was possibly a way that if we could gather local medicines, then we could start to afford medicine, and we wouldn't have to pay for shipped in really expensive ingredients. So in a way, that was the other reason that he's really interested in the medical application of the natural knowledge which he's talking about in this book, the Scotia Illustrata, and specifically in the Wildflowers of Scotland section. Okay, I want to get into the remedies. One last thing, of course, you'll find it at the beginning of every single video which has anything to do with herbalism. Don't try this at home. The medical chemicals which we use today have been synthesized, and we know the exact strength of them, and they're not mixed with any other chemicals. The medical chemicals which you'll get from plants, when they actually exist at all and they're not just made up, are completely unpredictable strength depending on the life stage of the plant and where it's been grown and how long it's been stored for. They also are mixed with other chemicals, and we might not know the mechanism of these other chemicals. If you get the wrong plant, you can end up very, very hurt, especially with some of the plants in the UK. So don't try this at home. Okay, let's get talking. The first kind of medicine which I want to talk about is what's called in Latin medicine which is elita, which is smeared on. Now, I suppose in my mind what I'm thinking of when I hear smeared on is when you get a sting from a stinging nettle, and in the UK at least we have a lot of stinging nettles. People who get stung by them quite often usually end up rubbing dock leaf on themselves, which either through magic or from the placebo effect immediately gets rid of the sting of the stinging nettle. Now, that might have been how some of the medicines were used, but I think in most cases they would have been prepared, these elita medications, with a mortar and pestle. Pestle and mortar. So here's an example. This is Catsia, very commonly found. Looks just like a dandelion, but the leaves are hairy. And the stems aren't hollow either. So we have this Catsia, and Robert Sibbald recommends if you get some Catsia and you use it with salt, you can treat burns with it. Now, what's really interesting about this is if you grind up a plant with salt, you pull out all of the liquid from that plant, and I suppose that would have been really helpful. So I think this is one of the medicines which was probably created in a pestle and mortar, just like this one. Now, every wildflower which Robert Sibbald believed had medical properties had certain virtues associated with it. Now, these were usually virtues which had been which were talked about in books in always the same way, were passed down from book to book. But they also sort of make sense for what the plant can do. So the medical virtues of Catsia, which Robert Sibbald in the book calls long-rooted hawkweed, he believed it to be a kind of hawkweed, were that it was cooling, drying, constricting, cleansing, and biting. So I think the first virtue there, the cooling part, was why it was so useful for burns. Other preparations of it were also used for digestion, sleep, difficulty, urination, pimples, and also high sex drive. I suppose we just need to cool down these people a little bit if your sex drive is too high. Now, a very similar kind of medication is a very similar preparation, I should say, is trita, which just means ground up. Now, this is definitely using the pestle and mortar in this case. So the example I have here for trita is the dandelion. I only found one for some reason. Catsias were everywhere, dandelions, I only found the one today when I was looking. Dandelions were ground up, and in particular, they were ground up for several disorders: swelling, sunburn, and scorching pustules. Now, the vires of dandelion are slightly different, although they have some overlap with the virtues of the hawkweeds. So dandelions constrict, strengthen, excite, and cleanse. So I think for the swelling, sunburn, and scorching pustules, we're talking about a combination of constricting and cleansing, perhaps. Well, that's my theory anyway. Now, other uses which Robert Sibbald recommended for the dandelion were to provoke urine, to open obstructions in the liver, and to bring sleep. That provoking urine one probably especially interesting to those of us who got to play with dandelions as a child. Okay, let me talk in more detail. The most important use of the pestle and mortar is to create powders. Now, powders are ubiquitous across the wildflowers of Scotland and across 17th century Scottish medicine, as far as I can tell. Now Robert Sibbald is especially interested, of course, in natural and locally available powders. And the powders he's especially interested in are ones made of root. So here I have in my very modern bottle some cinquefoil root. Cinquefoil, very common, you can find it everywhere. Has long roots, it actually grows on runners, but you can find the root if you dig enough. Now if you grind this up in the pestle and mortar and then leave it to dry and then grind it up again, you end up with a powder. And I suppose that's just like how we make ginger powder today. Although I doubt there's anyone with a pestle and mortar making ginger powder. Maybe there is, I don't know. Now, cinquefoil's virtues are that it was constricting and drying. And it was especially used, interestingly, as a febrifuge. Now, febrifuge rings bells for me. This is not a virtue, and it's not a treatment method. It's not saying it will treat fever, which it would just spell out if that's what it was trying to say. And it's not saying it's cooling. It's saying it is a febrifuge, and that puts cinquefoil in a special category. There were a few of these categories in 17th century medicine, and of course we still have them today. So there are still some medicines which are always used for fevers, for bringing down fevers, and there are also other medicines, for example painkillers. That's a category of medicine. You would use a painkiller regardless of whether you have pain in your tooth, in your back, in your muscles, in your legs, wherever the pain is, you use a painkiller and it stops it. The most common category in 17th century medicine was vulnerary. A vulnerary medicine or a vulnerary plant was useful for any kind of wound. Anytime you sustained any wound, use a vulnerary medicine and you'll be right as rain very soon. So this febrifuge, that was useful for bringing down any fever. And if I look at the use of a list of disorders which cinquefoil was used on, this starts to make sense. So it was used on flux, dysentery, prolapsed intestines, erysipelas, wounds, nosebleeds, coughs, eye problems, ulcers and kidney diseases. Now it's got this very long list of potential uses which suggests that it's shown some promise of all sorts of things. And a paper, which I'll put a link to in the description below, has suggested that the antibacterial properties of cinquefoil might actually have worked against infection and have even proved effective for very severe infections recently, although I think more research is needed, and of course it's unlikely to be as strong as the very, very strong medicines for infections that we've got today. Okay, let's move on from just the mortar and pestle. Let me talk to you about infusions. Now, an infusum, the Latin is infusum. If you're talking about an infused herb, the Latin is infusa. The English is infusion. An infusion is like a very strong tea. You have a wildflower, so a good example for this is duckweed, this one here. I call it duckweed, Robert Sibbald called it duck's meat. You find it all over the surface of ponds everywhere. So you get some duckweed, and I think probably fresh duckweed because it does dry up very quickly. You pour over some hot liquid, and once you've done that, you create for yourself a drink. You strain off the leaves of the whatever you're using, and you drink the infusion, just like you would a tea. Leave it to brew for a little bit, obviously. Now, did you notice there I said liquid? Well, in 17th century English medical texts, like in Culpeper's Herbal, the liquid is always water. And in modern times, infusions are always water. In 17th century Scottish texts, they are not always water. So I think the most common thing to infuse, the liquid for infusion, which I found in the Wildflowers of Scotland, was wine, either red wine or white wine, depending. People would also infuse in beer and in vinegar. I suppose it might last longer if you infused in a liquid like that, although I'm not sure. Now, infused duckweed was perfect for dealing with jaundice, and it was also useful for inflammation, gout, head pain and hernias in children. Now, a slightly more complicated remedy, or basically the same, is a decoction. Latin is decoctum, and of course the perfect passive participle, if you remember that chestnut from your Latin class, was decocta. Just like we have elita, trita, infusa, this is decocta, a decocted herb. Now, a decoction is where you, instead of adding hot water to a plant, you have the liquid and you have the plant together, and you heat them up together. Now, I suppose an example of this in the modern time might be a mulled wine or a cider. But in Robert Sibbald's book, one recommendation is oak leaves. Now, at the moment it's autumn in Britain, and there are beautiful leaves all over the ground everywhere, so these weren't very hard to pick up. I've tried them in my book since. Now, these are yellow oak leaves. Robert Sibbald requests red oak leaves, and his suggestion is that if you have oak leaves and you decoct them in wine, which probably just means heating them in wine, they would have had virtues of constricting, gluing and stopping up. And in particular, would have been useful for toothache. Now, you don't drink a decoction of oak leaves in wine, you use it as a mouthwash. The Latin for mouthwash is glutionis, throat wash gargarisma, a gargle. Fantastic word. Other uses for oak leaves were for dysentery, flux, heavy periods, so that's using that constricting virtue, but also sort of very strangely to force urination and to break up kidney stones and to treat painful urination, which almost seems like the opposite effect to some of the others, but that's 17th century Scottish medicine for you. Now, that wasn't the only way that you could use decoctions. So this very same remedy, decocted oak leaves, could also be used in baths. So if we have a balnea or an infessus, either of those words mean bath, and we add a decoction of oak leaves, this would have been useful for tightening anything that needed to be tightened up. Another example of herb often used in a bath is this toad flax. Now, I'm not sure about this, but I think that toad flax might have been used just strewn in a bath. I suppose in a slightly less romantic way than you see in the beautiful movies where people fill their baths with rose petals for the very wealthy. Now, toad flax's virtues are that it was warming, drying, opening and cleansing, and if you have a bath of toad flax, it releases urine, I suppose, just relaxes you that much. Interesting fact at this point, nowadays we might add a couple of drops of oil to a bath for aromatherapy purposes. Scottish medicine does not use any oils at all. Well, there's occasional references to rose oil, but very, very little about oils at all. So I suppose you're not going to get that bath in lavender oil, or bath with a couple of drops of lavender oil in 17th century Scotland. Other preparations of this toad flax were to speed up periods, get rid of spots, to whiten the skin. The whitening of the skin is very interesting. There's never any remedies to tan the skin, only if you've been working outside for too long, you can get rid of some of that tan with certain preparations. Toad flax also been used for jaundice, dropsy, wounds, ulcers and fistulas. So apparently a plant that was very relied upon by certain people. Okay, just one more preparation and then I'll stop the video because I think I've talked for long enough. Distillation is perhaps the most complicated one to explain. Now, let me give you an example. This is a red shank. It's less commonly seen than the other plants I've shown here, but you do quite often find it in gardens, which makes up for that, I suppose. Now, redshank's virtues are to cut into sharp humours, to open up and to break up. And the breaking up, I think, was why it was useful for kidney stones, a distillation of redshank used for kidney stones. Interestingly, it does have some other property, some other uses. So it's commonly used for wounds in cattle, and also for driving away flies and insects, which I was very surprised by, because when it was hanging in my wardrobe drying off, there were so many little insects and moths hanging around. I think that bit doesn't work at all. Okay, how do we distill a herb? Essentially, you would use an alembic in the 17th century. Now, we do have an alembic in the Turner collection here at Cardiff University, but we weren't able to move it, so I couldn't show it to you today. I'll see if I can add a photo or something like that. What you do is you add the wildflowers, or whatever you're using, and some water into the lower part of the alembic, the curcubit. You heat up that together just like you would with a decoction, but the top is sealed off, so there's nowhere for the steam to escape. The steam travels out through the alembic and and condenses into little droplets. And those droplets are caught at the bottom, and the caught droplets are counted as distilled. That's your medicine. Now, if you get enough of it, you end up with two substances. You end up with the water at the bottom, this distilled water, aqua destillata in the Latin, or we would call it today a hydrosol. So you get this hydrosol, and on the top you usually get a layer of essential oil which has the essence of the wildflowers contained within it. Now, interestingly, 17th century Scotland and 17th century England, and for all I know, 17th century Wales and Ireland, no interest at all in this essential oil. Culpeper suggests you actually leave little holes in the lid of whatever you're keeping it in, so that the oil can evaporate away and so it won't contaminate the actual useful hydrosol which you've got. So the hydrosol of this redshank was used for getting rid of kidney stones. And that's essentially it. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for today. If you want more, you can follow me on Twitter at Leafy History, and if you go to the hashtag Wildflowers of Scotland, you can see some of the remedies which I've found throughout the year while I've been translating this book. I want to say thank you very much to my funders for this year, who are the Alice McCosh Trust. Thank you very much once again for funding me. The Wildflower Society, who you can also follow on Twitter, and they do all sorts of really interesting things, and also the Botanical Research Fund, some great research. Of course, I also need to say thank you very much to the School of Pharmacy here at Cardiff University, who've allowed me to show off these fantastic objects. I'm not sure I talked about the weights in front of the book there. The very tiniest weight there, the 1 drachm measurement, that's how much of the febrifuge, of the cinquefoil root you would have needed for 1 dose of anti-fever medication. But anyway, thank you very much to the School of Pharmacy, and especially thank you to Phil Parks, who works in conservation at the School of History, Archaeology and Religion, and helped me move these objects across to this room so that we could film them today. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye bye.